I wanted to talk about natural rights and natural law. So, a question to ask yourself was, well, what's the difference? So, in the previous talk, I explained how natural law is basically saying don't abuse other people, don't abuse animals and people, don't abuse sentient beings, right? And that there's these three forms of abuse, which are aggression, which is the initiation of violence, deception, and theft or stealing. So, say that is like the eternal moral law, which is also just a rewording of the greatest commandments of Jesus. So, what's the difference between that and natural rights? What are your rights? And so, if you are familiar with the American Constitution, right, and the amendments called the Bill of Rights, you might think of those, or you may have heard of like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then, in various countries, right, there's these different political documents that tell people what their rights are supposedly, right? But if you look at, say, the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution, really, these are restrictions on government, right? So, like against slavery, involuntary servitude, against uh, having yourself disarmed, right? Nonviolent people being disarmed. That's what the Second Amendment is about, right? So you can be able to defend yourself. No unreasonable search or seizure in the Fourth Amendment, right? These are all restrictions against government. And what is it a restriction against fundamentally? It's a restriction against various forms of abuse, right? Because if you disarm people who are nonviolent, that's being abusive towards them. If you do an unreasonable search and seizure of someone's property or, home, that's abusive. Um, it's just one after another. Um, the Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment inflicted, right? That's another form of abuse, right? So, uh, and then in the Ninth Amendment, saying the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. What is that saying again fundamentally? Like, what is that a restriction again? It's saying just because a certain number of abuses that are being spoken against here in the Constitution doesn't mean that other abuses are okay, right? So it's a protection against abuses not listed in the Bill of Rights. So it's all fundamentally about saying no to various abuses by government, right? Because they were familiar with these abuses across the pond, right? And so they didn't want to have the same abuses occurring on this continent. All of these rights that they're saying belong to the people are fundamentally just the right to not be abused. They're just pointing out different forms of abuse and saying you have a right to not be inflicted with that. You have a right to not experience that, right? You have a right to be free from that abuse, right? That's what it is fundamentally. So, like I was pointing out with the logical fallacies, why is that never plainly explained, Well, maybe because it would be empowering to recognize what your true natural right is fundamentally and how that is really one and the same with the natural law, which is one and the same with the moral law given by divinity, known as the greatest commandments, which is to love God, others, and yourself, right? Because the opposite of loving action is abusive action. So that is the perfect law, and it's simple, but it's comprehensive and perfect and empowering when you realize, well, this really is what it's all about on an ethical level. The fundamental human right is to not be abused. There's various forms of abuse, and those have been called, those have been enumerated or detailed in what has been called like natural rights. But again, the natural rights are just pointing out various forms of abuse that are unacceptable, right? You have a right to not experience this form of abuse. You have a right to not experience that form of abuse. That's what it is fundamentally, or that's what it should be, you know. So the most fundamental human right is the right to not be abused. And that is in keeping with the greatest commandments of Jesus, which is the natural law. So they're really just different ways of looking at the same thing, different ways of looking at what is called, you know, the perfect law of liberty, which is the greatest commandments. In the interest of making this as clear as I can, I'll just make a couple more points. So, firstly, when we're talking about law, we can define that as simply a rule, right? If you look up the definition of law, you'll find, you know, it's a rule, sometimes made by people that work for government, other times not. It's a rule of conduct, right? A rule to govern the conduct of people. So, keeping that in mind, the Bill of Rights are rules for the government. And like I said, all of those rules are fundamentally just the rule against abuse. It's just the law against abuse, or the non-abuse principle, or the greatest commandments. That's what it is fundamentally. So you have all of these examples of ways that people that work for government can be abusive, and it's saying those are against the law, right? The Constitution is called the law of the land. So these are just rules against the government. And then you have laws directed at the people. In other words, people that don't work for the government. And, you know, those are laws like you can't murder, you can't steal, you can't commit extortion, right? All, not all, but many of which are basically just rules against abuse, right? So natural law and human-made law can coexist. There can be overlap when the human-made law is against an abuse, but it's not always, they don't always correspond. Oftentimes people make laws, governments make laws that aren't valid because they aren't actually against abuse, right? It can just be like a government saying, oh, you're not allowed to protest us, you know, you're not allowed to speak out against us, you know. And they can say that that's an abuse or an offense or whatever, but it's not really so, right? So if it's not actual initiation of violence, if it's not actual deception, and if it's not actual theft, then it's not an actual abuse. It's not an actual violation of natural law. So legislation, you know, laws made by Congress are rules of conduct for non-government employees. And then you have these Bill of Rights or human rights, which are rules of conduct or laws for people that work for these governing institutions. So I hope that you can see the clarity on that and the fundamental, simple dynamic at play, or the simple reality that law is, when it's valid, when it's in line with natural law, is a rule of conduct which is just an expression or details of the non-abuse principle, which is the greatest commandments of Jesus, again, because abuse is the opposite of love. So to hopefully make this even more clear, like, I can give a couple more examples from the Bill of Rights. So in the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law um, respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble. So if someone were to do those things, if government employees were to do those things, it would be abusive control, right? These are examples of abuse, right? If you're restricting someone's speech, in an abusive, controlling manner, right? That's abuse, right? If you're telling them what religion they can follow or they can't follow, or persecuting them for following a certain religion, that's abuse, right? If you are denying people the right to peaceably assemble somewhere, that's abusive, right? It's fundamentally, again and again, examples of abuse. And so that's what makes much of the content, though I would not say all of the content of the Bill of Rights, valid and important, is because it is corresponding with natural law. It is corresponding with the natural non-abuse principle, which, like I said in the talk on natural law, corresponds with our natural, God-designed, innate conscience, right? So that's why you can also call it natural. So likewise, in the Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. Yeah, if someone were to try and enter your house and want to stay there, and sleep in your bed or whatever, and eat your food without your consent, that would be abusive, right? That's an abuse. That's an act of aggression, right? So it's valid because, yeah, it's an example of abuse. But I hope you're seeing, like, that these rights, when they are valid, they're valid because they're just pointing out examples of abuse, of aggression, deception, or theft, and saying those are not okay. Those are not ethically sound, right? And then with the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendment, those are having to do with fair trial, right? Fair carrying out of justice. So again, it's the non-abuse principle, right? If you put someone through a mock trial, like governments often have and still do to this day, and exercise this fake form of justice, that's abusive towards the person that they're accusing and condemning, right? So again, it's just, here's another way state employees can be abusive. Therefore, you have a right to not be subject to that, right? You have a right to be free of that abuse. So the reason why this is so important is because when you have this moral clarity that really the only evil conduct there is abusive conduct, then that clarifies, is it acceptable for government or for anybody to restrict you in this way when you're not actually being abusive, if you're what they call, consensual crimes, or if they're just doing abusive things, but they say, oh, it's in the name of the greater good, or it's for safety. The thing to remember is that this is the perfect moral law, meaning there's no exceptions. It's the non-abuse principle for all time in all scenarios. There's never actually any exception to the rule. So most people accept abuse for one of two reasons. Either they think, well, a little bit of abuse or some level of abuse is okay in certain circumstances if, they say or we think that it will overall be for the greater good. That's one common false perception, called utilitarianism, basically. All government is basically utilitarian. All government is basically uh, communist in that sense as well, you could say, because it's this idea that in the name of the greater collective, you can violate the right of the individual, right? Collectivism versus individualism. Individualism is correct because it recognizes that the individual right of a person to not be abused is paramount and supreme in all scenarios. It doesn't matter if you say, oh, well, that individual is part of a collective, and so now things are different, or now they declared an emergency, so now abuse is okay, or whatever other scenario. Oh, now there's a war. Now abuse is okay. No, it's always wrong. And this is something pretty much any university student in the modern world is going to have trouble digesting because they've been indoctrinated with moral relativism and believe that it's not that clear cut. It's always a gray area and there's no moral absolutes. Well, there is. It's the greatest commandments of Jesus, otherwise known as the non-abuse principle, otherwise described as the non-aggression principle, which is just one of the three elements of that non-abuse principle. The non-deception principle, you could say, and the non-theft principle being the other two forms of abuse. That is what makes it the true natural law. And if you get that, then you recognize, well, it's not valid for some people to commit abuse for any reason. So whatever they come up with, because they say, oh, because we're the supreme authority, or it's for your own good, or whatever. The second reason I said, the first is the first misconception about abuse is that people think that it sometimes is acceptable, for the greater good or for safety or in an emergency or whatever. That's the first misconception. But the second is that people don't identify abuse as abuse. So they'll tell you, oh, that's not actually abusive, getting back to the law issue, right? It's called legislation or law for the people, the common folk. There's a law against extortion, right? But if a government employee does the same exact thing, but just puts a theatrical, wrapping on it and calls it taxation, people think, oh, well, that's okay, right? And then they say, oh, because you implicitly consented to this, and just making up a bunch of BS, basically, that doesn't hold up to scrutiny to supposedly, justify the extortion, which is an abusive act that if one neighbor were to do to another, it would be clearly identified as such and labeled criminal, right? Because you're doing something abusive, something aggressive to your neighbor. So the second big mistake is not recognizing abuse as abuse. So you either think abuse is sometimes okay, or you think that abuse isn't abuse when it's done by certain people. And then another misconception is calling things abusive that aren't actually abusive, right? So, hate speech laws is a common, current example that I've talked about previously. Or you see on social media, they'll put up a notice, oh, this is extremist content, as if something that is extreme, like extremely an uncommon view, that somehow is unethical in and of itself, which is completely false. Or that just because someone is expressing hate, which is just being defined as extreme dislike, that's inherently unethical. That's false too. They're actually using false examples of abuse to be abusive, right? So they're actually violating people's First Amendment rights, you could say, to free speech. They're doing that abusive act in the name of, goodness, in the name of virtue, right? It's the virtue signal. But what they're doing is actually abusive, and what the other person was doing wasn't actually, right? So you have to remember what constitutes actual abuse. Again, it's initiation of violence, it's deception or theft. Saying I really, 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 really don't like something, aka, or alternatively, I hate something, is not abusive. That's not an initiation of violence. You can have extreme dislike of things. That's okay. It's not hate. The whole idea of like hate speech or hate free zones, it's just nonsense. You should have a hatred for evil. You should have a hatred for abuse. So this false morality actually just supports this abusive um, system that we are deceived into accepting as legitimate. But to just again sum up on natural rights are basically just natural law applied toward governments, right? It's saying you don't have the right to do this to other people, and so therefore the people have the right to not be subject to it. And the natural law is again just a law of comprehensive love, which necessarily means that it's a law against the opposite of love, right? It's a law for love, and so therefore doing the opposite of the loving action is against that law. And the opposite of love again is abuse. All right, I hope this additional clarification was helpful to you. Thanks for listening.